Faith users are so spoiled in Shadow of the Erdtree, so now that we've ranked the 17 intelligence weapons, the 10 arcane weapons, we're going to rank the 27 faith weapons. Is Euporia the best faith weapon? Let's go! Let me know your rankings in the comments down below. I may go back and re-rank the original faith weapons against the new DLC ones. If you're interested in that, let me know that in the comments as well. Now, also, this start of this list is going to be very similar to the intelligence weapons because there are those like poo-poo weapons that have both intelligence and faith scaling, like Nanya's torch starting in D tier. This is a torch that does physical and fire damage. It has poor scaling for everything. It does have 65 build-up of madness, which isn't great for anything outside of PvP. And the weapon skill here just like holds the torch up and does like little pops of fire sort of around you a little bit. It's okay, but it's not great, and it's not the weapon that I would be using in really any scenario because it's actually a torch. Perfume bottle is next. This is a fist weapon that does fire damage as well, just like Nanya's torch. It's also got some madness build up here, so same criticisms of the fact that it's good for PvP but not for PvE. This one is actually good for PvP though, because of the madding spear hand strike, where you will get a solid amount of that madness build up when you do strike enemies with it. But for the most part here, you're not really going to be using this in PvE, which is what we're talking about here. Frenzied flame perfume bottle. So again, this is another madness weapon that has madness build up, but because this does straight fire damage, and fire damage is always good, you've got the value there. You can also put things like rolling sparks or something on it here, and you get like a solid amount of fire damage on it anyway. Like fire damage is just a good damage type to have. Obviously the madness build up means like nothing for PvE, but moving on to a weapon you didn't see in that intelligence video, Serpent Flail. Serpent Flail is a physical and fire flail that has slightly higher fire damage than physical, with an Ash of War that scales off faith, and though the weapon damage itself does mostly scale off dex, something to point out. Now the Flare O Serpent is the weapon skill here that you'll essentially like bring the weapon to you and buff the weapon with fire. Now you can remove this buff with a heavy attack where you'll slam it into the ground and do like an explosion. That damage on that explosion is like okay, but you won't really be aiming to do that. If you were going to use this weapon, you're mostly using it for the simple fact to actually get that buff, right? That fire damage buff that is a solid amount of damage. I'm not sure if it's a flat damage or if it's a percentage scale, but it worked out for me to be about 150 fire damage on top of whatever damage I was already doing. Now the flails themselves, like they don't have great attack combos because you can only use the light attacks here as well, because you want to keep that buff, you don't want to remove it. It limits the flexibility of this weapon. Like you could use guard counters or something, but you also can't use the roll attack because you will actually do that slam, which does remove the effect as well. So it's just hasn't got a lot of flexibility. It's very stuck within its specific niche of like having this effect and not having any sort of control over that. Plus it's a dex focused weapon that has an Ash of War that this sort of sails with faith because it's fire. Like it's a little weird. So that's why it's sitting at the top of the D tier. Moving on to the C tier, we'll start with the Golem Fist. Now this is a Smith script weapon that does scale with int and faith, and if you put intelligence or faith on it, both the scaling here is okay, and you can change the Ash of War into anything you like. Now because it's a fist weapon, you've got those fantastic combos that you can build up status effects very quickly, and it has a unique heavy attack where you'll like shoot the fist forward. If you're two-handing this weapon with the two fists, you'll then shoot both the fists forward. Now the damage on the fist is actually pretty good. It does good stance damage. You can follow up with critical hits here. The downside is that the range on that is just so low. Like you have to be really close to the enemy that you may as well just be using like your fists or using a weapon that has a bit more range, right? Because it's like this throw effect has such a low range. Fist weapons themselves have such a low range. So you're sort of stuck in this weird like hybrid that it doesn't alleviate the sort of negative effects of having a fist weapon as your main weapon. It can be buffed with like the smithing talisman and all that good stuff, but it's a cool weapon. Practicality though, it's not something you'll use a ton. Shadow Sunflower Blossom is a colossal weapon that does physical and holy damage that does scale better with faith than strength. Now this has the Shadow Sunflower Headbutt where you slam the blossom of the sunflower down, and you can then follow this up with a couple of attacks as well. This looks cool and should be cool, but the animations here are just so slow without enough AoE on that actual slam for like actually hit bosses. Like when you're like winding that up, like it needs to be a larger effect to hit a lot of bosses that move around a lot because of how long that animation takes to like go off. You'll never really use the follow-up attacks on this either, because by the time you got one of these attacks off, your chances are you're gonna need to like dodge, get out of the way, or just, you know, tank that damage, right? So it doesn't really work super well. And being in the colossal weapon category, there are so many fantastic colossal weapons, including ones that also have physical and holy damage, including on this list as well, that are better than this, that have much more flexibility. So it just sort of sits here in that C tier that's kind of okay, but like definitely isn't great. Death Knight's Twin Axes is next. This is a twinned weapon, so you get 2 axes for the price of 1 that does physical and lightning damage, which is fantastic. Now, this comes with Blink Bolt, which will shoot you forward, and then you can do like a little spinny animation with the like twin axe like variant on this. Blink Bolt does have some invincibility frames, but they are hard to actually get like the balance on it. It's not like say Quick Step or something like that. We can just quickly press like the weapon skill button, you'll get out of the way. There is like a wind up time to the Blink Bolt where you've got to sort of trigger the effect, then disappear for your invincibility frames and then appear. So it's not great to use it as like a dodge, but it does definitely work in that way. And it's just like an okay weapon realistically. Like the axe combos here are pretty okay. There is a better variant on this, essentially like a very similar weapon to this on this list. So that sort of puts it down a little bit on this list, but like it's a C weapon, so it's not too bad overall. Gazing Finger is a colossal weapon that does physical and magic damage, but requires intelligence and faith. Now this weapon is a little funky, so it mostly scales with intelligence and strength, even though it does require faith and dexterity. It does have that unique R2 where you like stamp the finger down, which does do solid damage, solid stance damage, right? Follow up with critical hits, all that good stuff. It's not really a faith weapon because of the fact that it's magic damage based, and it also has better intelligence scaling than most other things, like slightly lean strength, right? So this is a weird space. It's really just that weapon skill that is where the holy damage comes into play. Kotower's Resentment, as it's called, will slam the weapon down and then like lift it up, and there's like these sort of explosions that'll trigger out in front of you. Now this is holy damage and does scale with faith, so that's why this weapon is also kind of tricky, right? Like if you were making a faith build, you wouldn't really use this weapon because the normal attacks here are like intelligence scaling, and then, you know, vice versa, right? Intelligence builds wouldn't use this because the skill is using faith. So it's in a weird spot here, but it's not a bad weapon overall. It's just not something that I think most people would use. It doesn't have any really redeeming qualities that make you want to use it because of its kind of weird animations that are pretty slow, and then the skill that's kind of a weird in terms of its overall scaling. So it fits here in the C tier. Moving on to the Sword of Light. This is a straight sword that does physical and holy damage. It does scale slightly better with strength than faith. Now this comes with the weapon skill Light, which will shoot the sword up in the air, and these beams of light will trigger around. Now each one of these beams does damage itself, right? So each one of those beams will trigger damage on an enemy. Now you need to hit enough beams on enemies for that to be like worthwhile. So the larger the enemies are, the better, because you can hit multiple beams. Smaller enemies, like the worse. It does scale purely with faith, that weapon attack, and it also does buff your holy damage after you have used it, right? So you get a bit of benefit from there, which is sort of the main reason you would use this weapon, especially compared to its counterpart, the Sword of Darkness. You would only really be using this weapon for that holy damage buff to say then lean into using holy incantations, or maybe a pure holy scaling weapon that is just like significantly better than this. But in that case as well, you're probably better off removing the holy damage negation from a target with its counterpart than actually using this one, which we'll talk about a little bit further down the list. And that's sort of why it sits in this C tier. That is okay. It's definitely a usable weapon, but just the darkness variant is stronger because of a few reasons we'll get into when we get to that weapon. Fire Knight's Short Sword is next. This is a dagger that does physical and fire damage. Mostly physical damage here though. It does have a little bit of fire damage. It does have that nice like double hit R2 combo that's quite nice to have on daggers. Comes with quick step, but you can change this, and when you do infuse it with fire, it does have additional like flame scaling here as well for the fire damage. So lots of good things going for it, but there are definitely better Fire Knight weapons that we'll talk about in this list. There's also definitely better daggers, because the thing here really is that if you are using a dagger, especially like dual wielding daggers, you're typically looking for some sort of a status effect combo here, right? Not typically chasing like fire damage build up, which like isn't even a thing. Now, the main redeeming quality here is just like the fast attack combos and being able to dual wield it with other daggers for those fast attack combos, being able to infuse it with fire and get that additional scaling. But for the most part here, you would be using the alternatives than this weapon, especially in the dagger category. There are better daggers as well that have a bit more flexibility. So it's not like top of the list, but it is a good dagger, and that's why it's sitting sort of in the mid tier in this C tier. The lightning perfume bottle is next. Now this is the perfume bottle that scales only with lightning damage, and it does have both dex and faith scaling. Now you can add rolling sparks to this, which you absolutely will be doing because it's like the best of the perfume ashes of war. It is fixed now though, so you obviously can't use that like that bug. It's still pretty okay, right? Like because it's lightning damage, it does stagger enemies a little bit better than some of the other perfume bottles. Now you still have all the downsides here that you can't do like critical hit damage. You do have that low amount of poise, and the range on the overall attacks aren't fantastic, but just being able to like sort of roll away, keep a bit of distance, use rolling sparks, it's not bad. It's not bad. Like it fits in a similar category to the Frostbite perfume bottle. It just doesn't have, you know, the build up status effect that the Frostbite one does have, right? But it's still, because it's lightning damage, it's quite unique. So if you're fighting something that's, you know, weak to lightning damage, and because it's just solely that damage type, the damage numbers on this when you are fighting enemies isn't too bad. So it's a good weapon that you could definitely use if you want to try this perfume bottle style build, but not fantastic. The Black Steel Twin Blade is next. Now this is a pretty basic twin blade, like comes with spinning slash, you know, it's got some holy damage, got some physical damage, got some okay scaling here. Now the main reason you'd probably be using this is to put that new aspect of the Crucible Ash of War on it, because it does have that unique effect with the twin blade where you'll actually spin the twin blade during that animation compared to the typical just like thrust animation with normal other weapons. That's the main redeeming quality for this weapon, and the main reason you would typically use it in a build as well. Now it is a solid weapon because it is a twin blade, right? You don't have a whole lot of good holy or faith-based twin blades, except one we're going to talk about very late in this video, but otherwise there isn't a lot of other options that are quite good. This is actually one that is definitely worth using if you want to use that, especially if, say, you want to use a holy twin blade setup in the DLC, going through the DLC, and then at the end of the DLC you get access to the other one that's significantly better. You've got a lot of flexibility here because you can change that Ash of War into something else. You could dual wield it, you could put status effects on it as well. Like, it's not bad, it's unique in that way, but definitely not top of the list, and sort of sitting at the top of the C tier here with one weapon in front of it, and that's the Devionier's Hammer. Now this is a colossal weapon with physical and holy damage, mostly physical damage compared to holy, and this is those like colossal weapons I'm talking about here that have both physical and holy, like the Shadow Sunflower Blossom. That's just better in most ways, right? So because this is a Crucible Knight weapon, it is buffed with the Crucible Knight set. The weapon skill itself, Devionier's Vortex, is what actually gets buffed here. Now you'll put the weapon up in the air, you'll spin it around, you'll slam it down. It can flatten enemies, like knock them down, especially the charged variant on this. You won't typically charge it because it does take a while to actually charge. While the damage on the charge is quite strong once you have fully charged it, it's just the fact that it does take a long time for that wind up. You can get knocked out of that animation. You'll typically just use it uncharged, which is also the downside of it as well, is that even when it is uncharged, it is still have a long wind up time. So most of the time you won't rely on that for a lot of attacks. You'll be trying to weave that in between attack combos, which makes it sometimes tricky to get those effects off because you've got to rely on a window that's large enough to get it off. But the damage numbers here are pretty okay. It's definitely a weapon you could use, especially if you're cosplaying as a Crucible Knight. It's definitely good for that. Moving on to the B tier, we'll start off with the Black Steel Great Hammer, which is something that I was surprised by how much I liked it. So it's a great hammer with physical and holy damage, mostly physical compared to holy. Now this weapon has a unique guard counter. So you know those Black Knights that do that stupid attack that do, like, they drag the weapon on the ground, there's like that holy damage and it like bursts and it always clips you when you're trying to roll out of it. Happens to me all the time. Well, now you can do this to enemies with the guard counter on this weapon. You can essentially like thrust the hammer forward, and then that trailing gold effect will happen. That'll explode as well. Fantastic damage, as well as being able to stagger enemies with this. High attack rating as well, because it is a great hammer. And then you've also got this unique guard counter on it. That is why I mostly came to like this weapon. It does come with Endure, which you can totally change as well. Like you can put something like Sacred Blade on this, give yourself a little bit of ranged, which you don't have with this weapon because it is a great hammer. It's got very short range, gives you some of that alternative option there. Being able to guard counter as well and leading into that effect for this weapon is definitely the way you would go if you're going to use this weapon primarily, but it is quite good, and that's why it's sitting in the B tier. Leda's Sword is next. This is a light greatsword, physical and holy damage. That's kind of disappointing, unfortunately. Needle Piercer is the main unique aspect for this, which will generate 10 gold needles in the air that will all then like shoot towards a target. Now, each of those 10 needles is their own damage number, right? So you want to actually hit an enemy with as many of those 10 needles as possible. They're each their own projectile, and it can be tricky to land them all. Obviously, the larger the enemy, the more chance you have of actually hitting them. This is probably one of the worst of the light great swords, which is why it sits sort of in this B tier, but it is still good, right? Light great swords have fantastic attack combos. I just love being able to chain them together and just like the elegance, how they look. Needle Piercer as well, by the way, is mostly physical damage, and it does like purge all ailments and special effects on the target. So something that's a PvP, right? If you're using, you know, buffs, that sort of thing, it will dispel them. But that's like the main benefit in PvP. You wouldn't really be doing this in PvE because very, very rarely is that ever actually a thing that enemies are actually buffing themselves in any sort of a way. But overall, it's just okay, right? Like in terms of the light greatsword category and in terms of an Ash of War that is hard to get solid damage out of, the primary benefit is the fact that it is ranged, so you can get this off from distance, whereas you don't have to be in melee range to use like the basic attacks, but it's just not fantastic in a PvE setting because there are better light greatsword options that have the ability to change the Ash of War to something more useful. PvP, I can totally see the value, it just doesn't make that spot for me. The Great Sword of Damnation is a great sword that's physical and holy based. This has kind of poor faith scaling, by the way. It is mostly strength, so it's not so much of a faith hybrid build, it's mostly like a strength build and just like hitting the faith requirement here. Really solid stagger and good hyper armor on the first part of the skill animation. Golden Crux is the skill. You'll like leap up in the air and skewer a foe, and then like these barbs will like trigger from like underneath here. Now, if you hit this on like smaller enemies, you can actually like grab them and like slam this through the head, and like the barbs will like come out of them rather than like just like slamming it on the ground. For the most part here, right, like you won't get that animation trigger. It's mostly just essentially going to be like attacking normal enemies with this, you know, and like getting the AoE effect that does happen here. The damage here is pretty okay. Like it's a solid enough weapon that you could totally use, especially in like a Frenzied Flame sort of build. Slightly disappointing that it doesn't just come with Madness build up. Like I think maybe that would make the weapon significantly OP if in like a PvP setting for sure, but it definitely have like a valuable weapon and a little bit unique for some sort of a frenzied build, maybe if you were going to use something like that. But it's a solid weapon, it's just not incredible, so it doesn't land up super high on this list. Death Knight's Long Halved Axe is next. Now this is the other weapon that has Blink Bolt that I was mentioning earlier. It's a great axe with physical and lightning damage. Now you can Blink Bolt forward, and then you do sort of jump up in the air and do like a slam animation that is lightning charge. It does provide the iframes we were talking about before. I did really enjoy this weapon. I like the Great Axe's like heavy animation. It just feels fun to like swing a giant axe like with the power fantasy of it. I don't know, it's just got like really good value out of it, like good attack animations. It's a solid skill, right? Like same as with the other one, if you can time the iframes better. The damage on the actual lightning charge slam is higher here and stronger than the twinned axes we talked about earlier, so that's why this lands up a little bit higher. It's just a bit more flexible in that way that you can get a bit more value out of that effect. And definitely if you're using some sort of a Death Knight build, you know, using those like lightning incantations, right, and like the Death Knight armor, this is the weapon you would totally be using in that overall setup because of its value. It does scale slightly better with strength, by the way, than faith, but it's definitely what you would be using for those general builds, and it is a good weapon. That's why it sits in the B tier. Sword of Darkness is next. This is the Sword of Light's counterpart. Still a straight sword, still got physical, still got holy damage. Basically exactly the same in every other way except for that weapon skill, Darkness. This will raise the weapon up and do Darkness instead, which does deal holy damage, does scale off faith. Now, the benefit here is that you just need to like hit an enemy with the Darkness like cloud once, and it does its entire damage for that weapon skill. Whereas the light variant is all based on like those individual beams. So the damage numbers here are just going to be better across the board because it's so much easier to hit enemies with that effect. That's an AoE entirely around you. Also, it has a debuff effect on enemies rather than a buff on you. Now, this will debuff an enemy's holy damage resistance by 20%. Fantastic for all of those endgame bosses to base game Elden Ring that have all of that holy damage negation, and just a great like counterpart weapon to use if you're using a holy base build. Switch to this at the start of a fight, get the holy damage resistance reduced by 20%, switch back to your main weapon, and then you can just like slay away and deal all that holy damage to them, whether it's incantations or weapon base, what have you. So that's definitely why it sits higher on this list. I personally wouldn't use it as my primary weapon in a build, just because I don't typically like the straight sword animations. Like, they're not fantastic. It just never feels fun to use to me. But the versatility of being able to reduce the holy damage resistance for targets is the main reason why you would use this weapon. Quaylene's greatsword is next. Now, this isn't a greatsword. It's a heavy thrusting sword that does physical and fire damage, mostly physical damage here, unless you change the Ash of War it comes with, which is Impaling Thrust. If you put any of the flame infused Ash of Wars on it, even like the new Flame Skewer or Flame Spear, both are fantastic on this weapon, and it does significantly boost the amount of fire damage this weapon does. Now, when you're comparing this directly to, say, almost its counterpart in a way, the Fire Knight's greatsword, because they are very similar, because they have those same benefits, same as the short sword we talked about earlier, it's weaker in my opinion because it has those solely piercing focused attacks, especially compared to when you think about its overall damage output. The Colossal Sword greatsword is actually higher damage as well. So you've got like worse overall attack animations here. You still get the same Ash of Wars you can put on it, the same like benefit to increasing the overall flame and fire damage it can do, but just like ultimately it's not the primary weapon you would use in those setups, right? There's just better alternatives that are almost identical, except they have better attack animations. We'll talk about those when we get to them, but that's why it's sitting sort of here, like at the top of the B tier. You can totally see it sitting in the A tier because of the benefits, but you know, it's just when you think about it holistically, it's sort of sitting in this like mid-tier spot. The Horned Warrior's Sword is next. This is the other one that I struggled to put into B tier, but I just think it's not all the way there. So this is a curved sword, right? We obviously know how fantastic the curved sword attack animations are. Now, the benefit here as well is this is a twinned weapon, so you actually get two of them for the price of one. So you get those fantastic like dual wielding combos that are just fantastic. Now, there's no holy damage here, and it does have faith scaling, but you can't change its Ash of War. It comes with Horn Calling, which is what is the main like reason why it's faith scaling here. Now, this will slam the weapon into the ground, and these horns will like pop up on a target. This gives you some versatility by giving you a ranged option if you are just going to dual wield these curved swords. So there is some value in this weapon. The real downside is that there's no status effects here, and you can't actually put a status effect on this weapon because you can't change the Ash of War. If this weapon had a status effect on it, it would easily be like an S tier weapon, right? But because you can't do that, and in terms of a curved sword weapon where you're getting these attacks off very fast, it just feels like it kind of needs one to really succeed, when there's other alternatives that, you know, can do that while being able to change their Ash of War and put some more unique things on there that just deal better damage, or you know, can have the status effect build ups, etc. Like, it's a good weapon. It's definitely not, you know, the best in the category, right? But you know, it's still good, and could totally see it sitting in an A tier in certain lists as well. All right, we are moving on to A tier. We're starting with the Horned Warrior's Greatsword. This is a curved greatsword that only does physical damage, decent amount of physical damage. Now, it's also got the face scaling because of Horn Calling, except this is the Storm variant. So you'll swing the weapon around in a circle and like call forward the storm. Solid amount of range on this AoE that I was quite surprised with. You can follow this up with 2 additional endpoints, and you actually get a little bit of hyper armor to this as well. Like, you can sort of keep this skill going without being knocked out of it, which I found quite refreshing. I was fully expecting to take damage while spinning around in a circle here and just get completely knocked out of this animation, like it is with basically all of the DLC weapons. Now, you can buff this with things like the Wingsword Insignia or Millicent's Prosthetic as well for the successive attack buffs, which is really good combo for this weapon. It's a great curved sword alternative, especially if, say, you're used to a Bloodhound's Fang, which has still been the best curved greatsword in the game since the very beginning, but this gives you an alternative option that's quite fun in its own way, with an alternative Ash of War on it that has this nice effect that is really good for large groups of enemies to like deal damage to them. It also does solid amount of damage, plus being a larger weapon here, you've got like a decent amount of stance damage to follow up with critical hits. A lot of benefits to that. I could totally see someone putting these in a different order, like say putting the Horned Warrior Sword before this and the Great Sword after, like vice versa. And that's how I landed, because I felt that this is like stronger because of the higher amount of attack rating, the better Ash of War on it, and just being able to use, say, something like the Two-Handed Talisman here and being able to lean into those aspects a little bit more, I personally liked with this weapon compared to the Horned Warrior's Sword, but your opinion may vary. The Barbed Staff Spear is next. This is a great spear, physical, holy damage. If you're using this weapon, you'll mostly lean Faith in terms of its overall scaling. Now, Jorah's Inquisition is the weapon skill here, where you'll thrust the weapon up in the air, and these golden barbs will like shoot out in front front of you in like arcs. And you can like machine gun these out of the weapon. If you hold the weapon, more of them will come out. This does purely holy damage. The weird thing about this weapon is it also has blood loss buildup, and the weapon skill itself does blood loss buildup as well. Now you will have to be standing close enough to the target in order to be in range for like if you're using any of those like blood loss talismans that increase your attack power, etc. So just be mindful of that you've got to be close enough to like receive that benefits to like buffing your attack power when blood loss triggers. But it's also weird because you get blood loss triggering from a ranged holy damage Ash of War, right? That's like the only one in the game. Even holy damage in general, very rarely, I can't even think of another example off the top of my head that does blood loss directly, like included with a holy damage attack, not just on the same weapon. So that may change in like future patches, so be mindful of that. If it does change, this weapon definitely falls further down the list, but it is really that benefit here is why this weapon goes up higher. Being able to deal ranged damage with blood loss, get that status effect triggered, and it just like machine guns out of this weapon. Like there's no real downside to that, right? Like you can obviously use the great spear attacks, which aren't bad either. So just lots of benefits to this weapon and fantastic synergies with holy damage and, you know, the blood loss talismans we touched on as well. So that's why it's sitting here on this list. Rellana's twin blades are next. Now this is an interesting one. This is a twinned light greatsword that is physical, magic, and fire damage. Now it's only fire damage when dual wielding. The faith and the fire aspect is only coming into play with the offhand weapon. Now the weapon skill here, moon and fire stance as well. One of these is the moon variant where you'll like attack with these glintstone light waves that go forward. The other is the fire variant, which is the heavy attack here, which will bathe yourself in fire and you like spin around in a circle and deal like an AoE of fire damage. I considered putting this weapon lower on the list, right? It's obviously high in my intelligence video because like the main weapon is intelligence based, and for the most part here, that's like the main key thing with this weapon. And if you're using this weapon, say in one hand and something else in the other hand, right? Like this weapon's going to be in your right hand, so you're going to get the magic damage compared to it being in your left hand, which is when it becomes a fire and a faith weapon, right? If that makes sense. Now, the reason I kept it where it is because for the most part here, because this is a twinned light greatsword, if you're going to be using this weapon, you're actually going to be leaning into the unique aspects of it, into both the intelligence and the faith aspects of it, right? Very rarely would you use this weapon as specifically just like a magic light greatsword or as like a fire weapon or with like a light greatsword, right? If you're making a build with this weapon, which I did, and I'll link it here if you want to go and watch that, for the most part, you'll be two-handing this weapon and leaning into the stance effect to get the benefits from Rellana's cameo, the benefits to either the magic or the fire damage, right? Very similar to the Knight and Flame sword and that Knight and Flame stance from the base game. So you're mostly leaning into this weapon as a build on its own compared to adding things. So that fire damage is still important, and it is still quite a strong weapon in terms of if you are using it as a faith weapon and just using the faith variant on that light greatsword. And it is quite a strong weapon. So that's why it is sitting there on my list. Anvil's Hammer is next. This is a colossal weapon that does physical and fire damage. Fantastic amount of physical and fire damage as well. Now, this weapon is mostly a faith weapon, even though it does have the intelligence scaling. The weapon skill here is Smithing Art Spear, where you'll slam the weapon into the ground and these spears will like shoot up in front of you. Really good damage, like decent poise damage, mostly a faith weapon here because of the fire damage that the weapon does deal. Fantastic jump attacks you can lean into, all that good stuff. Like fantastic synergies with the two-handed talisman as well, and being able to lean into the benefits of using like a big colossal weapon like this, while also having the unique aspects of not just being physical damage, having the fire damage and the unique Ash of War, which typically if you're running like some sort of big bonk build, you know, with a colossal weapon, something like that, you don't typically get these unique aspects. You're usually just running at an enemy and slamming it down, but you've got some versatility with the Anvil Hammer. The Fire Knight's Greatsword is next. This is a colossal weapon that is physical and fire damage. Now, we touched on the other variants to the Fire Knight's sword earlier in this video. This one sits higher because it is a colossal sword that has fantastic attack combos with both its light and heavy attacks. You can lean into the two-handed talisman, the fantastic synergies with all the fire stuff like the Fire Scorpion Charm, etc. Now, you'll definitely want to be putting Flame Skewer or Flame Spear on this weapon to initiate like that innate fire damage and faith scaling benefits that the weapon does have when you infuse it with like fire or flame art. this is the best of the Fire Knight's weapons, right? It's got really solid stance damage. It's got a great attack rating, great weapon combos, flexibility to change the Ash of War to something valuable. I totally considered putting this in S tier. It's like right at the top of the A tier for me, because there's one weapon, which we're just about to talk about, that's like different, but like, you know, I kind of put these up next to each other. It's like, which one do I prefer? I'm only going to put one of them in S tier, and that's why it ended up at the top of the A tier, but absolutely fantastic weapon to make any sort of a build out of that's leaning into fire damage or like Fire Knight incantations, etc. Like just really strong across the board. So speaking of that S tier and that one weapon, it's the Spear of the Impaler. This is a great spear, physical and fire damage. Now it comes with Mesmer's Assault, which is a fantastic Ash of War that has like its initial attack, you'll like slash forward with fire damage. You can follow up to like thrust the spears forward multiple times, then you can slam it down to deal like this massive like explosion of like spears and stuff coming out. For the most part here, you'll only really use the first of these attack combos because there's no hyper armor on the continuations. You can use them like absolutely if like, you know, you just happen to like get like a perfect enemy that's just standing there and not going to attack you and knock you out of the animations, right? Totally fine. You absolutely use it. Now, the other benefit here is that it is a smithing weapon, so you can actually throw it with its heavy attack. So you've got range potential here. You've got a really solid Ash of War. You've got really solid physical and fire damage. Great synergies with all of your fire damage buffs, like your Flame Grant Me Strength and Fire Scorpion Charm, Two-Handed Talisman if you want to lean into that. Same as the Fire Knight's Greatsword as well, like we just talked about that. But the benefit that I prefer here is that you've got a really strong and unique Ash of War, the ability to throw the weapon for some ranged potential when you're just leaning into that. And it's also Mesmer's weapon, so it's pretty damn cool, right? But the best faith weapon in the Elden Ring DLC is now, as of the last patch, Euporia. This is a twin blade with physical and holy damage. I also made a build with this weapon as well, which I'll link here if you want to go check that out for a ton more information about exactly how this weapon works, because it is quite unique. What's unique about it here primarily is it has like this charging mechanic. So when you attack enemies, you'll like buff the weapon. Now there are two tiers to this. There's a first tier and a second tier. That second tier buffs the weapon's overall damage and holy damage output significantly more than the first tier. Now you can then dump this like buff effect, both levels of it, into Euporia's Vortex, which is the weapon skill. This will shoot the weapon forward and like it'll slash around in a circle. When this is uncharged, it'll just like spin around and like deal okay damage. When this is charged, it'll still spin around and deal okay damage, but there is like a giant beam that shoots out of it, which as of the last patch now does fantastic damage and is so much easier to build up these buffs to Euporia as well. Now you can also synergize this with all of your successive attacks, like your talismans, your two-handed talisman if you want to two-hand it, holy damage, scorpion charm, etc. because of the holy damage, right? Lots of benefits to this, and definitely now one of the best weapons in the game. I haven't compared it to the original weapons from the base game like the Blasphemous Blade, which is, you know, still the best weapon in Elden Ring, but it's absolutely up there in terms of an S tier weapon in Elden Ring that you can totally make some fantastic builds out of, with the flexibility of the twin blade moveset that has some great attack combos as well, plus a really unique weapon effect that's just like fun. I think we always get caught up in like making builds that are like super cool and like really, you know, like high damage, whatever. But this weapon is high damage, but it's also really fun because of the unique aspects of it, which is why I think this weapon is fantastic. You should check out my build if you want to make a build with it. But let me know your thoughts on this list in the comments down below. Thank you guys for watching this video till the end. Thank you to our members for supporting the channel. My name is Norza, and I hope you have a great day.